In the mist-shrouded Blue Ridge of 1851, 31 innocent children walked laughing into a narrow hollow on a perfect autumn morning. Only 4 ever emerged, barefoot, broken, their hair bleached white as bone. The mountain never gave the rest back. What it took, still remembers. The wind that morning carried the sharp bite of first frost and the sweet rot of fallen leaves. It moved through the hollow like a living thing, whispering secrets no settler dared repeat aloud. This is not merely a story of missing children. It is a parable of boundaries crossed, of sacred ground profaned, and of a justice older than the hills themselves. Imagine the scene as the first pale light of October 21, 1851, breaks over the folded ridges of western North Carolina. The Blue Ridge Mountains stand ancient and indifferent, their slopes cloaked in a riot of crimson, gold, and burning orange. Frost glitters on the ferns like scattered diamonds. Pigeon Creek chuckles coldly over moss-covered stones, its voice the only sound breaking the cathedral silence of the forest. In the tiny settlement of Ashkam, little more than 40 scattered farmhouses, a Presbyterian meeting hall that doubled as a schoolhouse, a grist mill, and a widow's store, 31 children gathered for what they believed would be a blessed day of wonder. This was a hard land, carved by Scots, Irish, and German families who had followed the Great Wagon Road south from Pennsylvania. They were pious folk, quick to quote scripture and quicker to sense when something in the earth felt wrong. They farmed steep bottoms, raised hogs in the woods, and distilled clear whiskey under the cover of night. They remembered old debts. They remembered old warnings. And they remembered, though they rarely spoke it, that some hollows were not meant for the footsteps of the living. The hollow had a name. On the few surviving maps it was marked Ashkam Hollow, after the first family to claim the valley. But the old ones, those who had traded with the Cherokee before the Trail of Tears tore the people from their sacred ground in 1838, knew its truer name. A name imperfectly learned from a language not their own. A name that translated, in the quiet dread of fireside whispers, as the place where the ground remembers. Children were forbidden to enter it after dusk. Hunters turned back in late autumn when the leaves grew thin. Women seeking galax or herbs gave its shadowed coves a wide berth. In 1829, Josiah Veach, whose farm sat nearest its mouth, had nailed a rough wooden cross to a massive beech tree at the trail's entrance. He told neighbors it marked the boundary between the world God made for man and something older. Something that watched. When pressed, Veach would only recount the words of old Hagenbeck, the German who had sold him the land. On the day of the deed, the old man had pointed a trembling finger at that same beech tree and rasped in broken English. You do not cross this mark at dusk. You do not send a child across it alone. Not for any reason. Not for any price. Hagenbeck died 2 years later without further explanation. Veach put up the cross on a night when the wind howling out of the hollow had kept him awake for the 3rd week running. A wind that sounded almost like breathing. Into this world stepped Evangeline Trout. She was 24, slender and fair-haired, the educated daughter of a Methodist circuit rider. She had arrived in Ashkam in the spring of 1850 with quiet authority that unsettled the mountain men. She did not soften her words for deacons. She did not defer to anxious fathers. In her letters and diary, preserved by Providence through 3 generations until 1971, she emerges as a woman of genuine faith, yet one whose thirst for knowledge sometimes outran caution. She boarded above Widow Prudence Holly's store, writing by tallow candlelight to her fiancé, Cornelius Bream, a seminarian at Princeton. In those pages we find both her devotion to God and her growing enchantment with the natural world. On October 15, a traveling Bavarian naturalist named Dr. Emmerich Kohl had passed through. Over supper he spoke of a rare orchid, greenish-white with dark purple veins, its petals shaped almost like lips, as though the flower itself were trying to speak. The old Cherokee, he said, had known it. It bloomed only in deep shade near Cold Springs in late October. Miss Trout was captivated. In her diary entry of October 18 she wrote of her decision, the children would take a walk into the hollow. It would be a living lesson in God's creation, more valuable than any primer. She saw no warning in the land. No one, it seems, had told the educated young woman from Salisbury about the cross on the beech tree. This single failure of memory would prove fateful. Dawn on the 21st was crystalline. The children ages 6 to 14 arrived at the meeting hall clutching small bundles of bread and apples. Their laughter rose like steam in the cold air. The oldest, 14-year-old Absalom Ravenel, carried himself with a gravity beyond his years. He read the King James Bible aloud to his sisters each night in a voice that visitors described as steady as judgment. The youngest, 6-year-old Comfort Pettigrew, clung to her rag doll named Susanna. 2 children were absent that day, one sick with fever, another kept home to help with apple pressing. 31 souls answered the morning prayer. When Miss Trude announced the nature walk, joy erupted. The children raced ahead along the path beside Pigeon Creek, their voices echoing like bells. She followed at the rear with the 2 oldest girls, Mercy Ekin and Constance Howard, her skirts brushing the frost-covered ferns. The path wound south between 2 ridges. By 8 o'clock they had passed Josiah Veach's cornfield. The farmer raised his hand in greeting but later confessed he never thought to ask how far they intended to go. By 9 they had passed the beech tree with its weathered cross. Its shadow fell across the trail like a final warning. Then the diary, Evangeline Trude's own record, falls silent for 6 days. What happened next lies in the space between history and judgment. The settlement did not realize anything was wrong until late afternoon. Widow Holly expected her boarder back for afternoon lessons. When dusk came and no children appeared, unease turned to dread. Men gathered with lanterns. Hounds were brought. By midnight 40 searchers moved through the woods. By morning the entire community had emptied into the hollow. They found almost nothing. In a small clearing perhaps half an acre wide, where a spring bubbled up through mossy stones, lay the remnants of an innocent picnic, neatly folded cloth bundles, apple cores on the moss, a small pair of patent leather shoes placed side by side as though their owner had simply sat down to rest and would return any moment. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. No blood. No torn clothing. The hounds refused to enter the clearing. They whined and backed away, tails tucked, eyes wide with animal terror. Josiah Veach, the man who had nailed the cross, rode into the clearing and later described a sensation like standing on the edge of an unseen cliff in total darkness. He fled faster than pride should have allowed. Reverend Obadiah Ashkam, 63, lame, a direct descendant of the valley's first settler, sat on a log at the clearing's edge for 2 full days, praying without ceasing. On the afternoon of the 23rd he heard a child's laughter floating from the eastern slope. He called out. The laughter stopped. No child appeared. The old preacher wept for the first time since his wife's death. The land had taken them. 6 days later, on October 27, for children stumbled out of the hollow near dusk. Their clothes were ragged. Their feet were bare and bleeding. Their hair, especially at the temples, had turned stark white. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply walked until they reached the meeting hall and collapsed. The survivors were Absalom Ravenel, 14. Mercy Ekin, 11. Phineas Traz, 8. And little Comfort Pettigrew, 6, the one who had carried the rag doll. They would not speak of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. Not during the frantic questioning. Not during the years of nightmares. Not even on their deathbeds, except, perhaps, in fragments passed through diaries and final confessions. The county called it a weather accident. The church called it providence. The land itself seemed to call it judgment. The schoolhouse was eventually burned. The marker at the hollow's mouth was removed. The story was buried 3 separate times by men who feared what it might awaken if spoken aloud. Yet the ground remembers. And tonight, as you sit listening in the safety of your home, far from those ancient ridges, know this: some hollows are still out there. Some boundaries still exist between what God permits and what the older powers claim. Some debts are paid not in coin, but in innocence. The children walked in singing. Only 4 walked out, changed. And the mountain has kept the other 27 for 175 years. What did they see in that clearing? What spoke to them with the voice of the orchid's lipped petals? And why did the ground choose to give 4 back, as living warnings? The answers lie deeper in the hollow. The search parties found only silence and small, haunting remnants. A pale blue ribbon, the kind a girl might use to tie her hair on a special day. A single unbroken slate pencil lying on the moss as though dropped mid-lesson. No footprints leading away. No signs of panic. The damp ground refused to yield a single clear track. Even the hounds, mountain dogs bred for bear and panther, stopped dead at the edge of the spring clearing. Two lay down and would not rise. One snapped and bit the man who tried to drag it across the invisible line where the spring bubbled up through the stones. The mountain had drawn a boundary. And it would not let the dogs cross. For 11 days the men of Ashkam walked the ridges in pairs and threes, beating laurel thickets with sticks, firing muskets into the cold air so the reports echoed like judgment across the hollows. They found almost nothing. A bent hickory branch. A curious pile of 11 small stones stacked neatly in a rock cleft 400 yards east of the clearing, stones that had not been there when the last hunting party passed through in early September. Ephraim cursed, who had lost his 10-year-old daughter in the walk, tore that little cairn apart with his bare hands. He never told the others what he found beneath it, a single braid of brown hair tied with red wool. His daughter's hair. He carried it home in silence and burned it in the hearth that same night. Only on his deathbed in 1878 did he confess the truth to his wife. He could not bear the thought of the others knowing that the mountain had left them a token. Let that image settle in your spirit. 31 children and their teacher walked 3/4 of a mile from a settlement of 40 families into a half-acre clearing, and simply ceased to exist there. No blood. No torn cloth. No broken branches. The spring continued its soft music. The leaves lay exactly where they had fallen. It was as if the world had opened its mouth, swallowed them whole, and closed. Again without a scar. This was not a disappearance. It was an extraction. The grief that settled over Ashkam was the quiet, biblical grief of mountain people who had known hardship since birth. There were no public wailings. No tolling bells. Women cooked and carried food to the stricken homes in silence. Men sat on porches with unseeing eyes, rifles across their knees, saying nothing. A prayer meeting was held on the evening of the 24th. Reverend Obadiah Ashkam read from the Book of Lamentations, "How lonely sits the city," but none of the families who had lost children attended. Not one. They were waiting. Thomasina Ravenel sat on her front step for days, refusing food, refusing comfort. When her husband tried to bring her inside, she whispered only, "A mother knows when her child is coming home." She kept her vigil until the morning of the 27th. That morning, the fog lay thick as wool across Pigeon Creek. Sibby Larkin, hauling water, saw movement on the far bank. 4 small figures stood knee-deep in the icy water, facing upstream like souls awaiting baptism. They did not shiver. They did not turn when she called. She waded in, the cold biting through her boots, and took the nearest child by the arm. It was 9-year-old Thaddeus Oregon. His hair, once dark brown, was now streaked white at the temples, as though frost had permanently claimed him. The others were 11-year-old Mercy Ekin, 8-year-old Phineas Traz, and 14-year-old Absalom Ravenel, the oldest, now missing 2 front teeth that had been in his mouth 6 days earlier. Their clothes were the same garments they had worn when they left. But they were clean, laundered, pressed, immaculate. After 6 days in the wild October woods, not a single stain, not a tear, not a spot of mud. Sibby Larkin would remember that detail until her own death in 1894. It was the cleanliness that broke something inside her. The children offered no resistance. They were neither warm nor cold to the touch. Their bare feet showed no cuts from the creek stones. Their eyes tracked movement but not faces. They walked where they were led, ate when food was placed before them, and slept when placed in beds. But they did not speak. They did not cry. They did not seem to recognize their own names. The families took them in and tried to love what had been returned. Absalom Ravenel's mother sat with him for hours, holding his hand, weeping, begging him to tell her where the others had gone. He stared at the wall. When he finally turned his head toward her, Thomasina later said she wished he had not. His eyes were not his eyes, she confessed. Whatever was looking out through them was not my son. In that moment she understood that the mountain had given her back a vessel, but the soul that once inhabited it had remained behind. Dr. Percal Cleve arrived from Morgan on the 29th. A trained physician from the University of Pennsylvania, he had been summoned specifically because of his reputation with strange cases. His surviving notes, preserved in the North Carolina Medical Society archives, describe 4 children in perfect physical health. No bruises. No signs of exposure. No malnutrition. Their weights matched what they had been on October 21. Their pulses were abnormally slow, Absalom's at only 52 beats per minute. They did not blink at bright lights. They did not flinch when a pistol was discharged in the next room. They were not catatonic in any sense I recognize, the doctor wrote. They were somewhere else. And what returned in their bodies does not entirely remember how to be children. Over the following months, 3 of the 4 began, in fragments, to return. Phineas Traws was the first. On November 11, 21 days after his return, his mother sat beside his bed singing the old hymn, "The Lord is my shepherd." The boy turned his head and said, "Clear as morning, Mama." Then he cried, for 3 unbroken hours. When the storm passed, he slept. The next morning he knew her. He knew his name. But he believed it was still summer. He had no memory of the hollow. He thought he had simply been ill. By spring he was attending school again in Morgan, where his mother had remarried. Outwardly normal. Yet he would not sleep without a lamp burning. He refused apples. And he would never, under any circumstance, walk east toward the mountains. Mercy Ekin returned more slowly and more hauntingly. She began speaking in March. She would stand at the window for long minutes, staring up the valley, and ask in a distant voice, "Has the singing stopped?" When pressed, she would only say, "Not the hymns. The other singing. The one that keeps on." Her mother recorded 7 separate references to this singing over the next 3 years. Mercy always used the definite article, as though everyone should already know what it was. The assumption that her mother could hear it too was what terrified the family most. In the final week of her life in 1919, at age 71, Mercy spoke her only direct words about the incident to her daughter: "We could not keep up with the others. They went on without us. We were the ones who fell behind." I do not know if that was a kindness, or a curse. Thaddeus came back in jagged pieces. He spoke single words in May, then sentences by June. In August he fell silent again for months. His life became a cycle, springs and summers nearly normal, autumns swallowed by silence. On the anniversary of the walk he would wander east, once walking 10 miles back toward the abandoned settlement. He was found sitting at the mouth of the hollow with his hands on the fallen beech tree that had once borne the cross. He never married. He worked his father's fields until he was committed to the state asylum in 1871. He died there in 1889, still carrying whatever secret the mountain had pressed into him. Absalom Ravenel, the oldest and the one who had read the King James Bible with such solemn power, never returned at all. He remained a living shell. He grew into a man who sat on the porch of the family cabin, eyes fixed on the eastern ridge, speaking to no one. His parents cared for him until they passed. The community fed him. But they all understood, the boy who had walked into the hollow had been judged worthy to stay. What came back was only his shadow. There is a terrible spiritual symmetry here. The Bible tells us that sometimes the remnant is spared not as mercy, but as witness. For return so that the horror would not be forgotten. For return so that the settlement and perhaps future generations would understand that some places are marked. Some grounds remember ancient claims. Some boundaries exist between the mercy of God and the older hungers that move beneath the hills. The clean clothes. The white temples. The impossible silence. The singing that mercy alone could still hear. These were not random survivals. They were signatures. The mountain had taken 27 children and their teacher as tithe. It had returned 4 marked vessels to carry the story forward like living gravestones. Their broken minds and haunted eyes served as warning: do not cross the line. Do not send the innocent where the ground remembers. The schoolhouse was later burned to the ground. The wooden cross was taken down. The settlement itself slowly emptied as families moved away, unwilling to live in the shadow of the hollow. The county ledger recorded it as a weather accident. The church called it Providence. But the four who returned knew better. And on certain October nights, when the frost lies heavy and the leaves burn crimson, some say you can still hear it, the faint, unearthly singing drifting down from the place where the ground remembers. A chorus of 27 young voices that never stopped. They are still walking deeper. They are still singing. And the mountain is still listening. The mountain does not forget. And sometimes it sends back broken messengers to ensure we never forget either. Absalom Ravenel, the solemn 14-year-old boy who once read the King James Bible with the steady voice of judgment itself, never truly returned. His body lived on for another 77 years, but the soul that once animated it remained in the place where the ground remembers. After his parents died in the 1863 influenza outbreak, he was passed to an uncle. When that uncle died in 1871, the community had no choice but to commit the silent man to the state sanitarium near Morgan. There he became a living ghost in the ward records for the next 57 years. The staff called him the Silent Man of Room East. He ate what was placed before him. He walked when led. He never spoke. He never wrote. He never drew. He showed no recognition of faces, mirrors, or loud sounds. Doctors who examined him over 12 years, including Dr. Percalcleve on 3 separate visits, found no disease, no physical defect. His appetite was healthy. His sleep regular. His body strong. Yet something essential had been removed. The only recorded anomaly in 57 years of ward journals was this: every year on October 21st, between the hours of 3 and 5 in the afternoon, Absalom would rise, walk to whatever window his room possessed that year, and stand facing east. Perfectly still. For exactly 2 hours. At 5 o'clock he would turn, sit on his bed, and resume his silence. He performed this ritual without fail from 1871 until 1927. On February 3, 1928, at the age of 91, the oldest living patient in the facility, Absalom Ravenel, broke his silence. At 3:06 in the afternoon, the day nurse, Imogene Darnell, saw him open his eyes that had remained closed since morning. In a clear, strong voice that carried the weight of decades unspoken, he said 3 words. "They are coming." Then he closed his eyes and died. That single sentence sent ripples through everyone who heard the story. Because for 77 years, Absalom had been a living monument to whatever had happened in that half-acre clearing. His annual ritual was not madness. It was observance. A watch kept by the only one old enough on that fateful day to perhaps understand the full weight of the invitation. The question consumed the entire settlement like a slow spiritual poison. Cornelius Bream, Evangeline Truth's fiancé, left Princeton and spent 4 months in Ashkam interviewing every living soul. His 400-page unpublished manuscript still rests in the rare books collection at the University of North Carolina, a document soaked in grief and unanswered questions. Reverend Obadiah Ashkam preached an annual sermon on the anniversary until his death in 1868. Each year he begged his shrinking congregation to search their hearts for the hidden sin that had invited such judgment. He could never name the sin, but he felt its shadow. Dr. Cleve returned 3 times over 20 years, filling drawers with notes he could never shape into a medical paper. He died in 1881 still haunted. Josiah Veach, the man who had nailed the cross to the beech tree, descended into madness. In the spring of 1861 he was found hanging in his barn with a note pinned to his shirt. "Only I should have cut down the tree. I should have cut it down in 1830. Forgive me." The land itself seemed cursed. Families moved away. The schoolhouse was burned. The settlement of Ashkam slowly emptied until only ruins and memory remained. Yet the deepest truth waited quietly in a leather diary. In 1971, a granddaughter of one of the surviving families handed Evangeline Truth's diary to a graduate student at Chapel Hill. What that student read, and what he later burned most of, changed everything. Miss Truth had written faithfully from her arrival in March 1850 until the night of October 20, 1851. The early pages are ordinary observations of pupils, homesickness, letters to her fiancé, reflections on mountain sermons. But something shifted in the summer of 1851. She began taking solitary walks. At first along the creek. Then along the northern ridge. Then, beginning in August, up into Ashkam Hollow, the place where the ground remembers. On August 9th she reached the beech tree with the cross. She asked Widow Holly about it and was told it was an old mark whose meaning had been forgotten. In her diary she wrote with the gentle condescension of an educated young woman, "A pity the settlement clings to such superstitions of a less enlightened age." On August 16th she walked past the cross into the clearing at the spring. She described it in almost biblical terms, light filtering through the high canopy like columns in a cathedral. The spring water so cold it made her teeth ache. She sat on the flat rock for nearly an hour. And there she first heard it. At first she thought it was wind. Then it resolved into something like distant voices. Not conversation, but singing rising and falling in rhythms just beyond understanding. She was not afraid. She assumed it was farmers on the far side of the ridge and that the cove acted as a natural sounding chamber. She slept soundly that night. By late August the sound had become the central focus of her walks. She began calling it the singing. Then simply it. She visited 3 times a week by mid-September, staying longer each time. She felt a powerful reluctance to leave. A sense that she was forgetting something vital. Then came the turning point. On October 6, she took 2 children with her on a Saturday afternoon, Absalom Ravenel and Mercy Ekin. She wanted to test whether others could hear the singing, afraid she might be imagining it. They heard it. Mercy was unsettled at first. Absalom was transfixed. After an hour he asked in a dreamy voice if they could return. They did return on October 13. This time with 4 children. The singing was clearer. Little Gideon Pettigrew laughed when he heard it. Verity Pelgrin, the girl who stammered, spoke clearly for the first time in the clearing. She asked whether the singers were inside the rock. When told it was only an echo, she replied without stammering, "If they are not inside the rock, then where are they?" She had to be led out by the hand. On the night of October 20th, the final night of her life, Evangeline Trout sat in her small room above the widow's store and wrote her last entry by tallow candlelight. Here is what she recorded, exactly as preserved. "I have been 3 times in the clearing at the spring and 3 times I have heard the singing. I cannot tell whether it is the singing of children or of something that has learned to sound like children. Dr. Cole told me such places exist resonant formations of rock where wind and water create sounds that uneducated people mistake for voices. The Cherokee marked them. He said there is no harm provided one does not go at dusk. I did not tell him I had already taken children up the hollow twice before. I did not tell him that Absalom heard words asking the children to come closer, but only the children, because I was too old. I did not tell him that Verity said the voices were beneath the stones and that they were lonely. I did not tell him that some of the children did not want to leave and that I had to carry Gideon out. I have decided I will take them all tomorrow, as a sanctioned school outing, so that we may hear it together as a class and understand its natural cause. I am certain this is the right course." She closed by noting a wind in the eaves that sounded, for a moment, like the singing even though they were 1.25 miles from the hollow. The diary ends there. The remaining pages are blank. This revelation reframes everything. Evangeline Trout did not innocently stumble into tragedy. She had been seduced by the singing. She had tested it on children in secret. She had heard the warnings in their words, that the voices wanted the children, not her, and still chose to bring 31 souls into the clearing on the morning of October 21st. Pride in her education. Hunger for wonder. A refusal to heed the old marks and older warnings. These were the sins Reverend Ashkam sensed but could not name. The hollow did not simply take them. It answered an invitation. The singing had been calling for months. It had learned the voices of children to lure children. It had used the beauty of God's creation, the light through the leaves, the cold spring, the autumn colors, as a trap. And the teacher, entrusted with their souls, had opened the gate. Some boundaries exist for a reason. Some places are marked the ground remembers because what sleeps there never truly sleeps. It waits. It sings. It selects. 27 children and their teacher walked in and were claimed. 4 were sent back, marked, changed, carrying the warning across generations like living epistles. Absalam Ravenel kept his vigil for 57 years until the day came when he could finally announce, "They are coming." Perhaps on that cold February afternoon in 1928, the debt was finally called due. Or perhaps the singing had simply grown tired of waiting and decided to collect the last witness. The mountain still stands. The spring still flows through mossy stones in that half-acre clearing. And on certain October afternoons, when the light falls just right and the frost kisses the leaves, some say the singing can still be heard, faint, beautiful, and endlessly patient. Waiting for the next soul curious enough to cross the line. Waiting for the next teacher who believes the old warnings are merely superstition. The ground remembers. And it is still hungry. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some invitations, once accepted, demand payment across generations. When Cornelius Breen returned to the settlement in the winter of 1851, he found Evangeline Truth's small room above Widow Holly's store exactly as she had left it on the morning of October 21. The bed was neatly made. Her hairbrush and small mirror rested on the washstand. But the leather diary lay open on the table beside a candle that had burned all the way down to a cold puddle of wax, something the meticulous young teacher had never done before. The diary was not open to her final entry of October 20th. It was open to August 16th, the day she first sat beside the spring and heard the singing. It was as if something had returned that night, turned the pages with hands that left no trace, and left the book open as a final, deliberate message. The diary passed quietly through generations until 1971, when it reached Hollister Vance, a graduate student researching antebellum education in the southern Appalachians. What began as academic curiosity became a lifelong haunting. In the spring of 1972, Vance traveled to the site with a geologist colleague. They confirmed a scientific explanation: narrow limestone fissures beneath the clearing. Under specific conditions, north wind, falling pressure, full creek, these fissures produced continuous sounds. To a child's sensitive ears, the sounds became distant voices. Sometimes conversation. Sometimes crying. Often singing. The geologist recorded the phenomenon. In a motel room that night, Vance closed his eyes while the tape played. He later wrote that he could almost hear his own name being called. A natural phenomenon. Nothing more. Or so it seemed. But Vance kept digging. In the dusty county records at Morganton, he uncovered a hidden pattern of tragedy stretching back to the first settlers. 17 documented incidents between 1789 and 1850, all in or near that same hollow. A hunter vanishing in 1814. 2 siblings found silent and dead within a year in 1833. A peddler's abandoned cart at the beech tree in 1844, his ledger left mid-sentence. The mill hand who disappeared the same year Veach nailed up the cross. The Orchard brothers in 1801, only one returned, and he hanged himself 3 weeks later. The incidents clustered in late autumn. They increased after wet summers. Most disturbingly, they rose when the settlement's population grew, as though the hollow responded to pressure, or to opportunity. Cherokee ethnographic records held at the Smithsonian offered an even older warning. The place was not called "The Ground Remembers." A more precise translation was "the place that keeps what it takes." One ethnographer recorded a strict prohibition: never bring children to the clearing. And never more than 1 at a time. Miss Truth had brought 2 on October 6. 4 on October 13, 31 on October 21. She had not merely crossed a boundary. She had broken it wide open. Vance came to believe the singing was never the true danger. It was only the lure. Something ancient and patient lived in that clearing, something that used beauty, curiosity, and the voices of children to draw its preferred prey. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming: the changed survivors, the mother's testimony that whatever looked out of my son's eyes was not my son, and one final discovery that shattered every rational explanation. In 1974, while examining sanitarium records, Vance found the connection that still chills the blood. On February 3, 1928, at 3:06 in the afternoon, the exact moment Absalam Ravenel opened his eyes and said, "They are coming," before dying, another patient in a distant ward also died. Her name was Orpha Quill. She had been committed in 1917 for hysterical melancholia and had remained completely silent and unresponsive for 11 years. At the precise same minute as Absalam, she opened her eyes, spoke the same 3 words in a clear voice, "They are coming," and died. Vance traced her history backward with relentless precision. She had appeared in Asheville in 1893 at the age of 48, walking out of the mountains alone, dressed in the tattered remains of a child's pinafore. She carried one object, a pressed flower, greenish-white with dark purple veins that looked almost black in certain light. A species unknown to any botanist. The exact flower Dr. Emmerich Cole had shown Evangeline Trute on October 15, 1851. Dental records, death photographs, and a small birthmark on the left wrist confirmed the impossible. Orpha Quill was Comfort Pettigrew. The 6-year-old girl who had clutched her rag doll Susanna and walked farthest into the clearing on that October morning had not simply disappeared. She had been capped. For 42 years. She walked out of the hollow in 1893 as a woman of 48, carrying a flower that should not exist, and lived another 35 years in perfect silence until she and Absalam Ravenel, the 2 oldest witnesses, were called home at the exact same moment. Hollister Vance never published his findings. He burned most of his manuscript in 1978, writing to his advisor that he felt he had looked through a window into something that should not be looked at. He began dreaming of the clearing. The dreams never left him. A carbon copy of his work survived by accident and surfaced in a 2019 estate sale. The historian who acquired it has refused to publish it. She has visited the site once. She will not go again. She believes the 27 children taken in 1851 remain, in some sense we cannot understand, still accounted for by the hollow. In 2006, an Appalachian trail hiker became lost in fog near the old settlement. He wandered into a half-acre clearing with a spring. He heard children singing. He sat on a flat rock and listened for what he thought was 15 minutes. When he returned to the trail, other hikers gave him conflicting dates. He had been missing for 4 days. In his pack was a pressed orchid, greenish-white, veined with purple. He had no memory of picking it. His hair turned white at the temples within a year. He does not speak of that day. This is the true horror of Ashkam Hollow. It was never merely a geological curiosity or a tragic accident born of a well-meaning teacher's pride. It was a place where something ancient and hungry maintained a patient claim. The singing was bait. The beauty of the autumn woods was camouflage. The children were the offering it preferred. Evangeline Trute's sin was not simple curiosity, it was the arrogance of modernity that dismisses old warnings as superstition. She heard the voices say they wanted only the children, yet she brought 31 anyway, certain her education and good intentions would protect them. The mountain corrected that pride with biblical finality. 27 children and their teacher were taken as tithe. 4 were returned as witnesses, broken, marked, carrying the story forward like living scrolls of warning. 1 was kept for 42 years and released only when the final account was settled. Today, a simple marker stands in a quiet cemetery in western North Carolina. No names. Only the date October 21, 1851, and the single word, lost. A descendant of the Ashkam family paid for it in 1951. She told the stonemason she had felt haunted her entire life by something just below the threshold of hearing, voices singing her name, calling her closer. Only the children, they whispered. Because she was no longer a child, she believed she was safe. She hoped the stone might discharge some small part of the debt owed to the 27 who never came home. The ground still remembers. The spring still flows. The fishers still sing when the wind is right. And somewhere in the deep time of those ancient ridges, something patient waits with its own slow measure of years. It is not haunted in the way ghost stories describe. It is worse. It is hungry in a way that does not respect our science, our timelines, or our disbelief. For walked out in 1851 so that we might be warned. Comfort Pettigrew walked out 42 years later carrying impossible proof. The hiker in 2006 walked out carrying the same flower. The invitation has never been withdrawn. So the next time you walk in the deep woods, especially in late October when the leaves burn crimson and the air grows sharp with frost, listen carefully. If you hear singing faint, beautiful, and strangely familiar, do not linger. Do not step closer. And whatever you do, do not bring children. Because the place that keeps what it takes is still open. And it is still calling. They are coming.